and welcome to the final episode of the Untold Stories of Irish Adoption. Throughout this series, I have discussed the history of adoption, the taboo surrounding the topic, the mother and baby homes, and heard personal stories from Irish adoptees. Now it's time to tell my story. My parents were unable to have children, and eventually decided that adoption was a suitable option for them. In February 1997, they adopted my brother, Jamie, who was born 3 months earlier. I was then born on the 14th of October 1998, and adopted at almost 6 months old on the 1st of April 1999. My adoption was never hidden from me. It wasn't a secret throughout my childhood that was then revealed to me when I was an adult. It also wasn't a conversation I was sat down to have. It was just something I've always been aware of, and if I ever had any questions about my adoption, they would be answered truthfully. I have limited information on my birth parents, and everything I know about them now has been information my parents were always very open with me about from a young age. I know their first names, where they're from, and that my birth mother went on to have another daughter less than 2 years after I was born. But that's where my knowledge about them ends. As mentioned before, my parents have always been open to speaking with me about mine and my brother's adoptions. I decided to sit my mum down and talk to her about her experience with adoption, the reactions from those around her, and the extensive process she and my dad had to go through to adopt Jamie and I. They rang every agency available to them and were constantly ignored or told they would have no luck as there were very few babies up for adoption at the time. Mum eventually got in contact with a social worker who helped them out.
She was very nice. She said she'd come down and visit us, which she did. She came down and sat with us and explained to us how difficult it was and what you'd have to go through, and I said to her that I still wanted to go ahead and try, even though there were very few babies. So she started the process for us, and we had to go through a huge amount of things. We had to have Garda clearance, medical clearance. All our families had to have, be okay, and we had to write down all our families' names, what they did for a living, everything like that. Our parents' views on adoption, our own views on things. And it just went on and on. It went on for a number of years, and then eventually we were approved. And we got the letter to say we were approved, and we are absolutely on a high, but they had absolutely no way of knowing, they said, when we'd ever get a baby.
After years of trying, they eventually adopted my brother in early 1997, and were lucky enough to adopt me just over 2 years later. They made visits to the foster home I was in so that I could get used to them before bringing me home.
We went out a couple of days, first on our own. We went out to see Emily and her to get used to us because she was nearly 5 months at that stage. And then a couple of days later, we brought Jamie with us to meet her, and we gave him a little doll to bring her for a present, and we gave him a little present that we said Emily had bought him because we were afraid he'd be jealous. And they'd given us a day set and everything, and then for some reason we couldn't, which was dreadful. I remember being so upset. It was only a few days, but it just seemed to make all the difference. But then they said definitely the following week, which was Easter week, and we went to collect Emily on April Fool's Day. So I hope people didn't think we were having a joke that we had a new daughter.
It was rare for a couple to get 2 babies just 2 years apart, as there were very few up for adoption in Ireland at the time. So the small town of Wicklow, where we live, began to talk.
There were very little babies in those days for adoption, and people couldn't believe when I got Emily because she was my second child. And a lot of people said that the only reason I got 2 was because my mother was so great in the church. Like, she used to hold all the church fates and do all the cakes, and she was very well in with the priest, and people thought that for some reason she was able to get me 2 children because she was high up in the church.
Mum remembers the day she brought me home. Since I was almost half a year old, my parents were advised not to throw a party for me as I may not react well, but my auntie couldn't resist and came to see me anyway. Afterwards, my mum took me for a walk around our estate to try and settle me.
Emily cried all night, so I had to walk around the block with her, and I started rubbing her face with a little blanket, and from then on she always had a blankie, and she used to bring it everywhere with her, no matter how dirty it was, but I think it was a comfort thing.
And so began my life. As my brother and I were growing up, Mum received comments from people around her, with one woman stopping her on the street to ask if Jamie's real mother gave him his name. This upset Mum, as she rightfully viewed herself as his real mother. A more humorous remark she received was from a woman in the local play park one day.
Another day I was in the playground with Emily and Jamie, and a neighbour of my sister's came over and she was admiring the kids and she said, "Oh, I didn't know you'd had another one." She says, "I remember you've been pregnant with him, but I don't remember you've been pregnant with her."
While people who were aware my parents had adopted had somewhat negative remarks to make, those looking at us with no knowledge about our family always said how me and my brother resembled mum and dad.
My mother and I were in Bray with Emily and Jamie and we were coming past McDonald's and Emily was running in front of us and I was calling her and a man said, "Oh, you needn't worry, you can't deny her anyway, she's the absolute spitting image of you."
As I grew up, I think I began to view being adopted as a novelty and a quirk that set me apart from other people. It was my fun fact about myself, and I would tell anyone who would listen to me, which at one point was all of the children from my estate.
And one of the funniest things was when Emily was playing out on the road with all her little friends. They were playing out in the front garden. She came up and knocked the door and they were all standing behind her and she said, "Mammy, aren't I adopted?" And I said, "Yes." And then she went, "Now I told you." And they all went off again. She thought it was a great thing.
One of my interviewees used the term naively open in the previous episode when speaking about telling people that you're adopted, and that perfectly describes how I was when I was younger. Being adopted is in no way shameful and wasn't something I feel like I should have hidden from people, but I just wish I was a bit more careful. I remember one day in PE class in school, things got heated during a game of bench ball and a girl in my class shouted at me and called me a joke because I was adopted on April Fool's Day. Another girl from my town sent Facebook messages around attempting to expose me for being adopted. These are situations I look back on now and see as pathetic and funny, but I was hurt by them when I was younger. While other people have been ignorant to how their actions may hurt someone, I've never let the negatives outweigh the positive of how I've always felt so loved by my family, with my mum thinking back on how my granny was made up with me and my brother when we were adopted.
The day we brought Jamie home and all our family were sitting in the sitting room, everyone was having a look at him and Mammy had him on her lap and she said, "Ah, look at him." She says, "He's like us, isn't he?" And I remember standing in the church doorway holding court saying that she had a new granddaughter when we got Emily.
Creating this mini podcast series has been a great learning experience for me, just as I hope it has been for you too. Being able to investigate and discover more information about something as personal as adoption in Ireland, as well as educate those who may not have much knowledge on it, is an opportunity I'm very grateful for. I would like to thank everyone involved for their contribution, and hope you, the listener, have enjoyed listening as much as I have creating. Now whenever somebody asks me any questions about my adoption, I can send them on this series as it holds all the information anybody could ever need. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.